So 2002 was sort of a watershed moment for me because it's the year that I found out that I had spina bifida, and that's just, 16 years ago? And it's also the year I found the Native American flute. This is like the most amazing instrument ever. It's different than any other instrument that I've ever played. It affects me in such a way that no other instrument has. And I play it differently than any other instrument. You know, when I played the piano or the guitar or the flute, I was always playing notes. But this one does it a little bit differently. I just sort of play whatever I feel. And I'd sort of like to give you a sample if I could. Well, thank you. I don't know how many of you have older siblings, but if you do, you know that part of the job description of being an older sibling is to occasionally torment your younger siblings. And I have a brother who's 3 years older than I, and he has never, not tormented me in some way or another. He's just that way. And I remember when we were very little, or when I was very little and he was, 3 years older than I, whenever we met strangers, he would always say, well, she's not really my sister. Our parents got her from the reservation. And we lived in Eureka, or on a farm near Eureka, South Dakota, which was about 40 miles from the Standing Rock Reservation. So it seemed sort of plausible to somebody who was maybe 3 years old. Plus my grandmothers and my aunts would always say, my God, she runs around like a wild Indian. And in the summertime, when I was outside a lot, I would get really brown, and they would say, she's brown like an Indian, so, I kind of thought I was. So I'm in my parents discovered that my brother was saying this to strangers, and they, in no uncertain terms, made him stop. And I was raised by Germans, and if any of you were raised by Germans, you know there are no uncertain terms. It's just like that. But they never bothered to tell me it wasn't true. And so I'm in first grade. This is like 3 years later, and I'm still thinking I'm an Indian. And one day, my first grade teacher walks up to my grandmother at lunchtime, and my grandmother was the head cook in the cafeteria. And I'm watching this out of the corner of my eye because I'm pretty sure this is not a good thing. My teacher talking to my grandmother. And she walks up there, and I can just barely hear it, and she says, why does Judy think she's an Indian? And my grandmother just puts down her utensils, and she locates me in the lunchroom. She marches out there, and there's no, hi Judy, how are you doing? It's just, what is this nonsense about you being an Indian? You're German just like everybody else. Turns around and marches back to the lunchroom, so that was the end of me being an Indian, or so I thought. But I don't know, there's something about all things native that just, touch me in a way that nothing else does. And other than that, I had a pretty normal childhood, except that I noticed my mother was always very protective of my back. And I didn't know until probably I was an adult that not everybody had a little spot at the base of their spine that was really sensitive, that if somebody touched it, it would just make you feel electric, and that you had to protect yourself from your older brother when he was mad at you because he knew it was there. I just, carrying heavy things, my mother would be sensitive to that. But other than that, and then when I got to be in junior high, I realized I had to go to the bathroom way more than anyone else. And it wasn't really that much of a problem, except when we went on a long road trip. Then people didn't want me in their car because they knew they'd have to stop every 50 miles to go to the bathroom. But it was really, more of a joke than it was a real issue. So, fast forward to 1977, And I just have to preface this. 1977 was when states like South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, they all had laws that were passed in about probably 1950 to 1958 that Native people could not practice their native religion or make artifacts related to it, so nobody could make a Native American flute. And in 1977, they finally introduced a law repealing those laws that Native people couldn't make Native American flutes. It was passed in 1978. So, that seems pretty recent to me. So that's why, people didn't see Native American flutes before then, and now you see them all the time. So anyway, this was, 1977 was my first year of teaching. And I came back to the farm in South Dakota where I grew up, just for a couple of weeks of R&R. And so one afternoon I'm walking around in the living room, and my mother is doing some sewing, hand sewing in the living room. And, I'm walking around just visiting with her, and then she said, "Judy, you just stepped on a needle." I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." So I reached down and pulled it out of my foot and gave it back to her, and she said, "You mean you didn't feel that?" And I said, "Well, no." And I honestly didn't think that people felt things with their feet because I didn't. And when people would go, walk over gravel or something really, a little warm, real hot, I could feel that. But warm, nothing. And I would think, when they go, ouch, 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 I go, yeah, what wimps? And she said, "Well, that's just not right." So we made an appointment with a doctor in Aberdeen, South Dakota, which was the nearest town of any size. And the doctor took some history and took some x-rays, and he said, "This is way beyond what I can do." And so he sent me to a neurosurgeon in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, who was at that time one of the better neurosurgeons in the nation. So I went down there and they said, "We have to put you in the hospital because we're going to do a lot of tests." At that time, x-ray was about the only imaging that they had. There weren't CT scans or MRIs or anything like that. So they did, I was in the hospital for a little over a week, and they were doing test after test after test. Things like, putting hot water in my bladder, cold water in the bladder, seeing what I could feel, poking every square inch of the lower part of my body with electronic needles to see if there was any sort of nerve reaction. And got to the end of that period of testing, and the neurosurgeon said, "We have no idea what's going on, but something is squeezing your spinal cord, and unless we can figure out a way to treat it, you'll probably be paralyzed within a decade." And I thought, wow, this isn't a good thing. He said, "We have to get in there and see what's going on. Without getting in there, we'll never know." And they talked to me about the risks of the surgery, one of which was paralysis. And, I'm thinking about all of this, and the paralysis one, the others, they were sort of like, oh, okay, I can deal with that. But the paralysis one, that gave me pause. But then I got to thinking about it, and I thought, if I'm going to be paralyzed, it's probably better if it happens when I'm 21, 22 years old, rather than when I'm really old, like 35 or 40. So I said, well, let's go ahead and do this. So then I had the surgery, and it went fairly well. When they got in there, they discovered there was a lipoma the size of my two fists that was wrapped in and around my spinal cord from L3 all the way to the bottom of the sacrum. And they removed as much of it as they could and tried to damage as few nerves as they could. But the upshot was they did some damage. But they did get rid of most of the lipoma, which was squeezing the spine. And I ended up with a paralyzed bladder, and some of the nerve structure in the lower half of my body was affected. So I ended up in the hospital for a long period of time because I had to do bladder retraining and all that sort of thing. And 32 days after I'd entered the hospital, I was finally done, ready to go home. So I went back to the farm for what was left of the summer. It's my mother and my dad too. They were real concerned about me, and knew that I would have to go back to teaching in the fall. And I remember coming back and going up to the room where I was staying and looking, and there on my bed was this Foder's Guide to Europe, because my summer went nothing like I had planned it. A friend of mine and I had planned going backpacking across Europe and getting Eurail passes and just having a fun time. And then I end up in the hospital for like ever. And then I get a letter from the insurance company that tells me that my stay in the hospital is not covered because it was a pre-existing condition. And if I had waited 2 weeks, I would have been covered for a year, and it would have been a year and they would have covered it. So 2 weeks later and I would have saved thousands and thousands of dollars. But I just didn't know, and that's kind of the way it was. So fast forward to 2002, and during that time there was a lot of just a gradual loss of strength and function and feeling in my lower limbs. And the kind of Germans that I was raised with have this attitude that there's no such thing as it can't be done. And so I embraced that philosophy because, it's just what you do if that's what you're raised with. And so when I noticed that my left leg had really atrophied, I just pretended like it hadn't. And whenever my body wouldn't do something that I really wanted it to do, I would just push harder. And I became more and more critical and viewed my body as more and more flawed. Until 2002, I remember I was sitting in a recliner on Christmas Eve, and I realized I couldn't curl my toes. And I started to cry. And I thought, I probably have to check this out. So a little bit later, I made an appointment with a neurologist, and it ended up that it was probably April or May when I finally got an appointment. And I went in and they did x-rays and all that sort of thing. And I remember going in to actually meet with the neurologist, and he looked at the x-rays and he said, "Oh, you poor thing." And then he ordered an MRI, and that was not what I expected. So a couple days later, I'm in my classroom. I was a teacher, and I'm in my classroom after school, and all the kids are gone, and I'm working on stuff, and all of a sudden the phone rings, and it's the radiologist who's looking at my MRI, and which is kind of unusual, Generally, the radiologist reads it, sends it to the doctor, and the doctor tells you what it's all about. But the radiologist called me, and he said, "I need some history before I can really interpret these results." And he asked me some pretty pointed questions about my childhood. And, was there something at the base of my spine? Did I stumble a lot as a kid? How about puberty? Did I notice anything at puberty? And we talked for about, a half hour, 45 minutes, I'm guessing, on the phone. And then he said, "Well, then what I thought was happening here actually is. You have a tethered cord." And I said, "What in the world is a tethered cord?" So he explained that it was, a fibroid cord that, attached to the spine, and then probably in your case to the sacrum. And as you grew, the spine grew, but the cord doesn't, and it just really puts a lot of pressure on the spinal column. And I said, "Oh, so what causes that?" He said, "Well, have you heard of spina bifida?" And I said, I'm 48 years old at this time, and I say, "No." And so then he explained what that was. So it was the first time that I even knew I had spina bifida. So I said, "So what do you do about something like that?" And he said, "Well, that's not my area of expertise, but I do know that, in some cases they sever the tethered cord, and it releases the pressure on the spine, and the nerves can sometimes, recover a little bit." And then all of a sudden I asked this question, and I said, "Do you think I'll ever be able to stand on my tiptoes?" Because it had been like decades since I could stand on my tiptoes. And he kind of laughed, and he said, "Well, nobody can promise you that, but, maybe, I don't know. You'll just have to see." So it gave me this sense of hope I hadn't had in a long, long time, and I was just like elated. And that night I remember I had this dream. I'm on my tiptoes, spinning around, and it's just like the greatest feeling in the world. And I'm walking. I pictured myself back on the farm, and we had this big corral, on the west side of the barn. And my brother and I used to get up on these boards. They were 2x12s on the top, and I suppose the corral fence was, well, yeah, it was about this high. And we would get up there and we would chase each other across that corral fence. And I, pictured myself doing that also. So I'm all excited, and I make an appointment at the Mayo Clinic for early in June, as early as I possibly can. And after school is out, I go up there, and I'm there for 3 days, and they do all these tests, and then I finally have a meeting with a neurosurgeon who kind of interprets all these results, and he said, I just don't think it's a good idea to do surgery. Even if we sever that cord, at your age, all of those muscles and all the ligaments and everything has been in this position for so long, it's very unlikely that anything will really change, and we might create problems that you don't currently have. And he said that and your reduced mobility make you a very poor risk for surgery. Well, I'm thinking, here's my Germanness coming in, poor risk for surgery? What the hell? And then I say, well, what if I'm willing to take the risk? And he said, well, you might be willing to, but I'm not. And it was just like, sink, just sinking feeling. So I drove back home, and the next couple of weeks were not fun. And one of my friends really noticed this sort of whirlpool that was sucking me down, and tried to find all sorts of ways to bring me out of that. And we always spent a month up in northern Minnesota in the summertime on vacation. And she and a couple of her family members came up for a week to join us. And one of the excursions that we did while we were up there was to a city called Pine River, where they had a native artifact store, among other things. But we stopped at the native artifact store because I always like to do that. And that's where I saw this very flute. It was just kind of sitting on a stand, a beautiful stand, and I looked at it and I thought, this is really beautiful. I'm looking at it and I'm picking it up, and then I asked the store owner, can I play it? And he said, well, I'm supposed to have these straws, sterile straws that you put in the end before you play it. Oh, what the heck, go ahead. So I had played the flute when I was in college and high school, so I'm like this. And I'm trying to figure out how to make it work. And so he laughs and he says, you have to put that in your mouth. So I put it in my mouth and I started to play, and it was the most amazing feeling. It was kind of like my fingers were remembering something. And I was just playing, and then I stopped, and the store owner said, oh, you've done this before. I said, no, I've never seen anything like this. And he said, well, you sound like Carlos Nakai. And I didn't have any notion who Carlos Nakai was at the time, but I have since learned. Anyway, I took it home or not home, but back to the resort, and I was just playing and playing and playing. All night long I was playing. And I remember even when the mosquitoes came out, I was sitting on a bench, and as long as I was playing, the mosquitoes didn't bite me. And so my friend came over, and she sat next to me, and she said, now how is it you can play that instrument like that? And I said, I don't know. I just kind of let it happen. I just play, and then when something kind of unusual happens, I try to do it again, and it's sort of like it's teaching me how to play. And so I'm playing along, and then I stop, and then I figure out, oh, this makes a loon sound. And the loons had just started to come out, and I was making this loon sound, and they started to answer back, and it was just a remarkable thing. And she said, that is just an instrument. The way you play it, and if I were to pick that up and play it, it wouldn't sound the same way. And, I knew that was probably true, but I kind of wanted to make her feel okay, and I said, oh, I'm sure you could do that. And she said, I couldn't. And she said, it's really what you bring to that instrument that makes you able to play it. So then I was just kind of quiet, and she said, your body is kind of the same way. And so what do you mean? She said, it's just an instrument. It's what you bring to it that it will do for you. And it's sort of, there was like a switch inside my head that just kind of went, and all of a sudden all that railing against my body, all that criticism, all that push, 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 and making it wrong sort of started to soften a little bit. And I took a little different attitude toward my body. And my birthday was the very next day, so I got this card from my friend that had a Mother Teresa quote that said, "No matter how flawed the pen, God writes beautifully." And so I took that attitude towards my body, the same attitude I took toward the flute, with some gentleness and some wonder, and just let it see what it can do. So, one more time, I'd just like to see what kind of gift the flute has to give tonight.
If you'd like for questions or comments about any of our stories, I think our storytellers